10 men were taken to the gallows in Nuremberg. One of them was Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations of the High Command of the Wehrmacht. His last words before falling through the trapdoor were, "I greet you, my eternal Germany." Jodl was not a field commander, but the gear that converted the orders of Hitler into military directives. From his office came out documents that authorized summary executions, reprisals against civilians, and cooperation with the SS. His signature figured in the Commissar Order and in the Commando Order, two instructions that eliminated all protection for prisoners and enemy soldiers. For the tribunal of Nuremberg, he was not a simple transmitter, he was a direct responsible one. Why did he end up on the gallows next to the Nazi leaders? Was he a simple soldier who obeyed or someone who decided? What converted him into one of the faces of the war crime? From Würzburg to the Reichswehr, the birth of a soldier. The 10th of May of 1890, in the Bavarian city of Würzburg, was born Alfred Joseph Ferdinand Jodl. His origin was marked by the social conventions of the era. He was an extramarital son of the artillery captain Johannes Jodl and of Therese Baumgärtler of peasant ancestry. In the rigid structure of German society, this condition represented an obstacle for the child. It was not until the year 1899, when his father abandoned active service and contracted matrimony, that Alfred could officially carry the paternal surname. The family environment reflected a double profile. On one hand, the military tradition was firmly represented in the figure of his father and in the career that later his brother Ferdinand would follow, born in 1896 and destined to become a general of the Wehrmacht. On the other hand, the uncle Friedrich Jodl, philosopher and pedagogue at the University of Vienna, contributed an academic dimension that contrasted with the military orientation of the rest of the family. This combination of influences offered the young Alfred an environment where military discipline and intellectual thought coexisted. During his childhood, he attended primary school in Würzburg and, subsequently, continued his studies in Munich at the Theresian Gymnasium. His academic performance was marked by constancy and method more than by exceptional brilliance. In 1903, he entered the Kadettenkorps of Munich, an institution destined to prepare young men for the military career. There, he acquired a rigorous formation in values of obedience, hierarchy, and service. His instructors described him as a disciplined and reliable cadet, qualities that converted him into a suitable candidate for the officer corps. In July of 1910, with 20 years of age, he joined as an aspirant the 4th Regiment of Light Artillery of the Bavarian Army, with base in Augsburg. The following year, he was sent to the War School of Munich, where he deepened in technical knowledge about artillery and tactics. This formative period resulted decisive for his career, since it prepared him to coordinate indirect fire operations and to handle the logistical complexities that modern artillery implied. The 28th of October of 1912, he received the commission of lieutenant, consolidating his official entry into the officer corps. 1 year before, in September of 1913, he had contracted matrimony with Irma von Bullion, belonging to a Bavarian aristocratic family. The union strengthened his social position within the military environment, although there was no offspring. The 1st of August of 1914, with the outbreak of the Great War, Germany declared general mobilization. Jodl, with 24 years, joined his regiment in the initial offensive against France. His baptism of fire took place the 20th of August of that same year during the Battle of Saarburg in the region of Lorraine. The 4th Regiment of Light Artillery supported the advance of the 6th Bavarian Army. In that action, Jodl was wounded in the right thigh by enemy fire, which forced him to remain hospitalized several months until March of 1915. The wound in combat earned him the Iron Cross of Second Class, a decoration that, although widely awarded, represented a formal recognition of performance under fire. After his recovery, he was promoted to First Lieutenant. In 1916, he was assigned to the Eastern Front, serving as battery commander in the 72nd Field Artillery Regiment of the Austro-Hungarian Army. There he faced war conditions very different from those of the Western Front. Operations in open spaces, logistical problems due to extensive supply lines, and the need for mobility of the artillery. The Eastern Front provided him with a broader operational perspective. The command of multinational units, the coordination between German and Austro-Hungarian troops, and the demands of the extreme climate familiarized him with complex scenarios. In 1917, he returned to the Western Front, performing in staff functions. This experience integrated him into strategic planning, into logistical organization, and into the drafting of operational orders. In March of 1918, he received the Iron Cross of First Class, a reflection of his performance in combat and in planning labors. Upon finishing the war with the armistice of the 11th of November of 1918, Jodl was a young officer with experience in direct combat and in staff. He had served on both fronts and had witnessed the transition from the initial offensive to the final defeat. The Treaty of Versailles of 1919 drastically reduced the military capabilities of Germany. The army was left limited to 100,000 men, without obligatory military service, without heavy artillery, and without general staff. Thousands of officers were demobilized. However, some were retained for their experience and technical preparation. Jodl found himself among them. That same year, he was assigned to the 22nd Regiment of Light Artillery and, shortly after, to the 21st Regiment of Artillery in Landsberg am Lech, where he remained until 1921, when he was promoted to captain. The decade of 1920 was marked by political and economic instability. Germany was going through internal revolts, coup attempts, uncontrolled inflation, and foreign occupations. In that context, the Reichswehr maintained itself as a reduced and isolated professional institution centered on preserving discipline and on training an elite of officers. In 1923, Jodl attended a course for command assistants in Berlin, and the following year he was assigned to the Ministry of the Reichswehr, where he was in charge of administrative functions linked to military reorganization. Between 1927 and 1929, he formed part of the General Staff of the 7th Division in Munich. Subsequently, he returned to the 7th Bavarian Artillery Regiment as Chief of Battery. This alternation between functions of direct command and staff tasks allowed him to acquire balanced experience in both fields. Between 1928 and 1932, he served as a professor of tactics and military history at the War School of Munich. During that stage, he dedicated himself to analyzing campaigns of the Great War, extracting operational lessons, and transmitting to new generations of officers a methodological approach based on discipline, planning, and systematic analysis. In February of 1932, he was promoted to major. That same year, he was named Group Chief in the Operations Department of the Truppenamt, an institution that, under an administrative appearance, fulfilled the functions of a covert general staff. Although the Treaty of Versailles formally prohibited its existence, the German army thus maintained the continuity of strategic doctrine and of operational planning. There, Jodl familiarized himself with the analysis of historical operations and with the elaboration of hypothetical scenarios for future conflicts. In this environment, he met and established links with Wilhelm Keitel, who later would become his direct superior during the Second World War. Both shared a professional profile characteristic of the Reichswehr: technical officers, politically discreet, and committed to the preservation of the military tradition despite the limitations of the treaty. The 30th of January of 1933, Adolf Hitler was named Chancellor of the Reich. This event transformed in a decisive manner the political and military panorama of Germany. For officers like Jodl, who had consolidated their career in the period of restrictions, now opened a scenario of expansion and rearmament. With more than 2 decades of service, decorated for his participation in the Great War and formed in the clandestine structures of the General Staff, Alfred Jodl found himself in a position to assume new responsibilities in a Germany that was beginning to leave behind the limitations of Versailles. The rise in the Third Reich from officer to strategist of power. The arrival of the National Socialist regime gradually modified the conditions that had restricted the German armed forces since the end of the Great War. In the first months, the new government promoted a process of pragmatic cooperation with the military high command. Werner von Blomberg, designated Minister of War and Commander-in-Chief of the Reichswehr, accepted to work in a coordinated manner with Adolf Hitler to secure the necessary resources in the modernization of the military institution. The army, which for 14 years had maintained a low profile under the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles, began to glimpse an expansion that until then seemed unattainable. In March of 1935, Berlin announced the establishment of obligatory military service. The measure, in open violation of the peace agreements, was accompanied by a nominal change of great scope. The Reichswehr transformed officially into Wehrmacht. The new name reflected not only an administrative reorganization, but also a program of growth that projected the capacity to mobilize several million troops in case of conflict. The rearmament advanced with rapidity through the intensive production of airplanes, tanks, and modern artillery. To administer this process, the Ministry of War reorganized its internal structure, creating specialized departments in the joint planning of the three arms. In that same year, Alfred Jodl was transferred from the Truppenamt, the covert office that had maintained staff functions under the limitations of Versailles, towards the new Wehrmachtführungsamt, the office of direction of the Wehrmacht. There he was named Chief of the Section of National Defense. The promotion to colonel accompanied this appointment, situating him in a post of growing responsibility within the military apparatus. His tasks consisted of coordinating studies and plans that integrated Army, Navy, and Air Force with the objective of achieving a common operational doctrine. The experience acquired in previous years in the elaboration of hypothetical scenarios allowed him to adapt to this challenge. Modern war, as it was conceived in the second half of the decade of 1930, required close coordination between arms of a different nature. The concept of combined operations, which included the simultaneous employment of land units, air forces, and naval elements, became a central axis of the staff studies. Jodl became one of the officers in charge of giving form to these principles. Although in this stage he did not maintain direct contact with Hitler, his analyses reached the superior levels of decision and were valued as reference documents for strategic planning. The position that he occupied within the ministry situated him among the officers with a future projection in the new scheme. The year 1938 marked a turning point. An internal crisis, known as the Blomberg-Fritsch affair, modified from the root the command structure. The Minister of War, Werner von Blomberg, was forced to resign after a personal scandal. Werner von Fritsch, commander of the army, was removed under accusations that turned out to be unfounded. Hitler took advantage of the situation to dissolve the Ministry of War and establish in its place the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Wehrmacht, an organ directly subordinate to the Führer. Wilhelm Keitel was named chief of this new organism, and the structure centralized around Hitler all military decisions. In August of 1938, Jodl was designated chief of the operations department of the OKW, denominated Wehrmacht-Führungsstab. His responsibility consisted of converting the political directives of Hitler into concrete operational plans and coordinating the execution of the operations in progress. The post situated him in the nucleus of decision-making. His function was not political in a strict sense, but it converted him into an essential intermediary between the orders of the Führer and the practical application in the military field. The first scenario in which he performed this role was the Austrian crisis. In March of 1938, Hitler ordered the preparation of the annexation of Austria. The occupation plan, denominated Otto, foresaw the entry of divisions from Bavaria towards Vienna and other key regions. Jodl supervised the drafting of the operational directives and the logistical organization. The 11th of March, the Wehrmacht received the order to advance, and the following day the troops crossed the border. The annexation, known as Anschluss, was executed without significant resistance. The rapid result validated the efficacy of the new coordination system implemented in the OKW. The Austrian success reinforced the confidence of Hitler in the capacity of his military apparatus. A few months later, in September of 1938, the Sudeten crisis was unleashed. Germany demanded from Czechoslovakia the cession of this territory, inhabited by a German-speaking population. The situation placed Europe on the brink of a conflict. The OKW, under the supervision of Jodl, elaborated intervention plans in case of Czechoslovak resistance. These documents detailed penetration operations from various directions, with coordination between armored units, infantry, and aviation. The 30th of September, the signing of the Munich Agreement resolved the crisis. The United Kingdom and France accepted the cession of the Sudetenland to Germany, thus avoiding the war. Although the invasion plans were not executed, the preparation demonstrated the capacity of the OKW to organize complex operations in reduced timeframes. For Jodl, it was a confirmation that the new structure functioned as an effective tool of territorial expansion. In March of 1939, Germany completed the dissolution of Czechoslovakia. The troops occupied Bohemia and Moravia, establishing a protectorate under the control of the Reich. The OKW directed the operation with rapid deployments and without relevant confrontations. For Jodl, the experience represented a new exercise in the translation of political objectives into concrete military actions. The annexations of Austria and Czechoslovakia expanded the resources and the territory under German control. These operations, executed with success, reinforced the perception that the Wehrmacht could respond with efficacy to the ambitions of Hitler. Within the OKW, Jodl was consolidating himself as the principal planner of operations, while Keitel acted as administrative chief and direct liaison with the Führer. The combination of both posts structured a system where political decisions were transformed into centralized military directives. Between 1938 and 1939, the Operations Department of the OKW carried out studies for war scenarios that contemplated simultaneous confrontations against several powers. Jodl drafted strategic deployment directives, supervised military exercises, and elaborated alternative plans in the face of an eventual intervention by France and the United Kingdom. His office functioned as the neuralgic center of planning, channeling towards the military commands the orders derived from the expansive policy of the regime. In the summer of 1939, the attention was concentrated on Poland. Hitler decided to resolve by force the question of Danzig and of the Polish corridor. The invasion preparations were accelerated under the coordination of the OKW. The 23rd of August, barely 1 week before the start of hostilities, Alfred Jodl was formally named Chief of Operations of the OKW, a post he already performed de facto. With that, he was established as one of the central figures of the German military structure. While Keitel assumed the role of political and administrative liaison, Jodl was the one in charge of transforming the orders of Hitler into detailed and viable plans. This system consolidated the role of the Operations Department as a key instrument in the direction of German military policy. The combination of institutional discipline, staff experience, and personal loyalty to the Führer had transformed Jodl into one of the principal technical executors of the expansionism of the Third Reich. Upon arriving the end of 1939, the German war machine was prepared for a conflict of continental dimensions. The next scenario would develop on the Polish front, and with it would open a new phase in the trajectory of Alfred Jodl, marked by total war in Europe. The architect of conquest, the lightning war at the service of Hitler. The 1st of September of 1939, at 4 hours and 45 minutes, the German artillery opened fire against the peninsula of Westerplatte in the Free City of Danzig. With that shot began the invasion of Poland, an operation denominated Case White. The planning of the campaign had required months of preparation, and the coordination was supervised by the operations staff of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, directed by Alfred Jodl. From that office were elaborated the orders that regulated the initial movements and the deployment sequence of the German forces. The scheme contemplated a pincer attack from several directions. The Army Group North was to advance from East Prussia and Pomerania, while the Army Group South would penetrate from Silesia and neighboring Slovakia. The strategic objective consisted of rapidly surrounding the Polish forces in the western zone, impeding their retreat towards the Vistula River, where they could organize a prolonged defense. The coordination between land units and aviation became an essential element of the plan, with the aim of maintaining constant pressure on the communication routes and the concentrations of enemy troops. 2 days after the start of the invasion, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany. However, on the immediate operational plane, no relevant offensives occurred on the Western Front. This circumstance allowed the operations in Poland to continue according to what was planned, without direct interference from Allied forces. The Luftwaffe achieved air superiority in a few days. The greater part of the Polish aviation was destroyed on the ground during the initial attacks. The systematic bombing of railways and roads made difficult the movements of the Polish army. At the same time, the German armored divisions exploited the created breaches and advanced with rapidity, closing enveloping movements that nullified the adversary's capacity for maneuver. The 28th of September, after a prolonged siege, Warsaw capitulated. In little more than 4 weeks, the Polish forces were defeated and the territory was left divided between Germany and the Soviet Union in accordance with the secret clauses of the pact signed in August between the ministers Ribbentrop and Molotov. The Polish campaign became the reference model for subsequent operations. Even when the term blitzkrieg did not form an official part of German doctrine, the pattern employed combined concentrated attacks, rapid penetration by armoured forces, immediate air support and encirclement of large units before they could establish new defensive lines. From his office in the High Command, Jodl coordinated the application of these principles in the orders that were transmitted to the army groups. His function consisted of ensuring that the general directives of Hitler were transformed into clear technical dispositions for the commanders in the field. After the victory in Poland, the attention was directed towards France and the Low Countries. The first plans, elaborated in October of 1939, reproduced in essence the advance employed in 1914 through Belgium. However, the predictability of this scheme motivated internal debates. Finally, the proposal of Erich von Manstein was adopted as the main plan, an advance of armoured forces through the Ardennes, with the objective of crossing the Meuse River and encircling the Allied forces in the north. Jodl participated in the coordination of this plan, denominated Case Yellow. The definitive document was approved in February of 1940. The synchronization between land units and aviation was established, incorporating lessons obtained in Poland. The offensive began the 10th of May. The troops rapidly crossed the Ardennes and opened a breach at Sedan. In a few days, they reached the coast of the English Channel, encircling the British Army and several French divisions. Approximately 300,000 Allied soldiers managed to evacuate from Dunkirk towards Great Britain, but the French defeat was already irreversible. The 14th of June, Paris was occupied, and the 22nd of June the armistice was signed in Compiègne, in the same railway car where 2 decades before Germany had accepted its defeat. For the High Command, the Western campaign represented the confirmation that the doctrine of rapid war could be applied with success on the Western Front. In parallel, Hitler ordered to secure control of the north of Europe. Denmark and Norway resulted strategically essential, since from the Norwegian port of Narvik, the Swedish iron ore was exported during the months in which the Baltic remained frozen. The Operation Weserübung was prepared from the operations staff of the OKW. The invasion began the 9th of April of 1940. Denmark was occupied in a few hours without significant resistance. In Norway, on the other hand, prolonged combats occurred in port cities and especially in Narvik, where British and French forces disembarked. The operation demanded precise coordination between the Navy, aviation and the Army, with simultaneous landings in Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim and Stavanger. Although the Allied intervention represented an obstacle, the German offensive in France forced the British to evacuate Norway in June, leaving the country under German control. The Norwegian campaign stood out for its logistical complexity and for the need to synchronize operations on several maritime and land fronts. From the OKW, Jodl supervised directives that regulated the simultaneity of the actions. The success allowed to secure the strategic supplies of iron and established advanced bases in the North Atlantic. During these months of successive victories, the coordination work was expanded beyond the military. The Ministry of Propaganda of Joseph Goebbels used the operations reports transmitted from the OKW to elaborate official communiques. The joint meetings between the operations staff and the propaganda sought to guarantee coherence between the military reality and the image projected to public opinion. The flow of information was carefully controlled, highlighting successes and minimizing setbacks. Although the responsibility for propaganda fell to Goebbels, the Office of Jodl became an indispensable channel for supplying the initial data. After the French capitulation, Hitler concentrated his attention on the Soviet Union. From the summer of 1940, the studies for an offensive in the east were initiated. The operation would receive the name of Barbarossa. The general objective was to destroy the Red Army in the western zone of the country and to secure control of the agricultural resources of Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus. The 18th of December of 1940, Hitler signed Directive No. 21. The document established the offensive on 3 main axes: the Army Group North towards Leningrad, the center towards Moscow and the south towards Kiev. A campaign of weeks was conceived, based on speed and on the expanded application of the principles that had given success in Poland and France. From the operations department of the OKW, Jodl participated in the drafting of the operational directives. His office had to coordinate the orders that transformed the general intentions of the Führer into specific dispositions for the commanders on the front. In these preparations, the unprecedented magnitude of the challenge was observed. Vast distances, dispersed industrial resources, and extreme climatic conditions. In the spring of 1941, dispositions began to be issued that transcended conventional military logic. One of them was the Commissar Order, elaborated in May, which stipulated the immediate execution of the Soviet political commissars captured. The document carried the signature of Keitel and the operational approval of the Department of Jodl, which converted him into a transmitter of orders that linked military planning with ideological objectives. The offensive was initially programmed for May of 1941, but logistical delays and the need to intervene in the Balkans forced it to be postponed. The 22nd of June finally began the largest military operation of contemporary history. The operations staff of the OKW, under the leadership of Alfred Jodl, directed the initial phase of this campaign, which would open a completely new stage in the war. War in the East, the machinery of extermination. In the early morning of the 22nd of June of 1941, 3 million German soldiers and of the Allied states of the Axis crossed the border towards the Soviet Union on a front that extended from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The Operation Barbarossa became the most extensive land offensive in modern military history, surpassing in scale and ambition all the previous campaigns of the Wehrmacht. From his position in the high command of the Wehrmacht, Alfred Jodl had coordinated for months the operational planning. The directives emanating from his office regulated the movements of the three large army groups, the north towards Leningrad, the center towards Moscow, and the south with objectives in Kiev and subsequently in the Caucasus. The general plan sought the rapid destruction of the Red Army in the Western Soviet zone, followed by the occupation of the main industrial and political centers. The attack began with a massive bombing over the Soviet airfields, which destroyed on the ground a large part of the enemy aviation during the first hours. The German air superiority allowed the armored divisions to advance with constant support from the Luftwaffe, following an operational pattern that had shown efficacy in Poland and France. In the first weeks, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were surrounded in large pockets in Białystok, Minsk, and Smolensk. The pace of advance seemed to confirm the forecasts of a brief and decisive campaign. However, the war in the East was governed by orders that transcended conventional military logic. In June of 1941, before the start of the invasion, Hitler had promulgated the so-called Commissar Order. The document, endorsed in the High Command and distributed by the department directed by Jodl, established that all captured Soviet political commissars had to be executed immediately after their detention. These officials of the Communist Party, assigned to the units to ensure ideological fidelity, were excluded from the protection of international conventions. The directive was applied systematically during the first months of the campaign, resulting in thousands of summary executions. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war also differed from what was observed in previous conflicts. During the summer and autumn of 1941, the number of captured reached gigantic proportions. In the Battle of Kiev, approximately 600,000 Soviet soldiers were surrounded and taken prisoner. In Smolensk, Uman, and Vyazma Bryansk, other hundreds of thousands suffered the same fate. The German infrastructure was not prepared to absorb such massive quantities. The prisoners were held in improvised camps without sufficient provisions, which caused massive deaths from hunger, cold, and diseases. Towards the end of that year, of the more than 3 million Soviet soldiers captured, around 2 million had died in captivity. Although there was no explicit order that dictated the systematic extermination of the prisoners, the ideological framework of the campaign and the dispositions transmitted by the OKW facilitated policies of extreme negligence. The Office of Operations under the leadership of Jodl was in charge of coordinating the transfers and of transmitting security instructions that established the cooperation between units of the Wehrmacht and detachments of the SS. That cooperation extended to the activity of the Einsatzgruppen, mobile units of the SS destined for mass executions of Jews, political commissars, and others considered enemies of the regime. The OKW issued directives that required the regular troops to provide logistical and security support to these detachments. Thus, the Wehrmacht facilitated transport, lodging and military cover so that the Einsatzgruppen could operate without restrictions in the occupied territories. In parallel, the Wehrmacht received instructions to apply collective reprisals against the civilian population in response to resistance actions. The orders transmitted from the Department of Jodl authorized executions of hostages and destruction of entire villages as an immediate response to any attack against German troops. In Belarus and Ukraine, these measures translated into mass executions and in the devastation of rural communities. In October of 1942, the so-called Commando Order was promulgated. Signed by Keitel and distributed by the operations area of the OKW, it established that any Allied commando captured behind the lines had to be executed without exception, even if he surrendered voluntarily. Although intended for the Western Front, this disposition was also applied in the East, confirming the continuity of a pattern of orders that eliminated traditional protections of the law of war. Meanwhile, the main operations on the front advanced towards Moscow. After the summer encirclements, Hitler ordered an offensive destined to capture the Soviet capital before the arrival of winter. The Operation Typhoon began in October of 1941. The German forces surrounded large contingents in Vyazma and Bryansk, capturing hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Nevertheless, the advance slowed progressively due to the autumn rains, which converted the roads into quagmires, and to the critical extension of the supply lines. In December, the German forces had reached positions less than 30 kilometers from Moscow, but the arrival of winter paralyzed their operations. The Red Army launched a massive counter-offensive that forced the Germans to retreat for the first time since the start of the war. In the records of the OKW, Jodl informed Hitler about the impossibility of continuing the offensive, although the orders from Berlin insisted on maintaining the positions without strategic withdrawals. The winter of 1941 to 1942 marked the first great setback of the Wehrmacht. The inability to take Moscow demonstrated that the conflict in the east would not follow the pattern of rapid campaigns. The casualties amounted to hundreds of thousands, and the front was left stabilized on an extensive and difficult-to-sustain line. The directives of Hitler, transmitted through the Department of Jodl, ordered to resist in all sectors without retreating. This policy led to entire divisions remaining in unsustainable positions, suffering additional losses from freezing and lack of supplies. Simultaneously, in the occupied zones, the Wehrmacht continued implicated in repression tasks. The persecution of partisans, the deportation of entire populations, and the cooperation with the SS for the implementation of policies of ideological extermination were maintained as part of the functions assigned to the regular troops. The war in the East integrated in a systematic manner conventional military operations and repressive measures. After the failure of the offensive against Moscow, Hitler decided to reorient the strategy for the campaign of 1942. The main objective became the capture of the oil fields of the Caucasus and of the city of Stalingrad, situated on the banks of the Volga. Jodl and his department participated in the elaboration of the directives that regulated the offensive, denominated Case Blue. The operation began in June of 1942, with significant advances towards the Don and the Volga. However, the decision of Hitler to divide the forces between Stalingrad and the Caucasus introduced difficulties in the planning. The operations department faithfully transmitted the orders, although the internal documents themselves pointed out the risk of dispersing efforts in two strategic directions. This new campaign in the south of the Soviet Union would open a different phase of the conflict. The Eastern Front, until then marked by rapid advances and massive encirclements, was approaching a turning point that would modify in a decisive manner the course of the war. Collapse and fidelity, the Reich in ruins. The Operation Blue was initiated the 28th of June of 1942 with the objective of reaching the oil fields of the Caucasus and capturing the city of Stalingrad. The plan supposed the reorganization of the German deployment in the south. The Army Group South was divided into two formations, the Army Group A, in charge of the offensive towards the Caucasus, and the Army Group B, oriented towards the Volga. From the High Command of the Wehrmacht, Alfred Jodl transmitted the directives of Hitler to the commanders in the field. The planning documents record that he had pointed out in internal communications the risk of dividing the main forces on two strategic axes, but even so he complied strictly with the task of distributing the operational orders. The obedience to superior instructions continued to mark his function as chief of the operations staff. During the summer, the German troops advanced with rapidity towards the Don River and in August reached the approaches to Stalingrad. At the same time, the formations destined for the Caucasus achieved initial progress, occupying Maikop and Grozny, although without managing to control the oil fields in their entirety. The offensive reached a considerable territorial extension, but the deployment was left increasingly dispersed. In Stalingrad, what had been conceived as a rapid operation transformed into a prolonged battle. The urban combats, developed house by house and building by building, consumed resources on a scale that surpassed any initial forecast. The German army was left immersed in a confrontation of attrition for which it was not prepared nor equipped. In November of 1942, the Soviet command launched the Operation Uranus. The attacks on the flanks, sustained mainly by Romanian and Hungarian troops, managed to encircle the 6th German Army in the interior of the city. From Berlin, the operations department directed by Jodl transmitted the orders of Hitler, which prohibited any withdrawal or attempt at a breakout. The commander of the 6th Army, Friedrich Paulus, requested authorization on repeated occasions to break the encirclement, but the official responses insisted on maintaining the position. The supply was entrusted to an airlift organized by the Luftwaffe. From the beginning, it proved insufficient to sustain a force of hundreds of thousands of men in siege conditions. The lack of food, the scarcity of fuel, and the drop in temperatures caused a rapid deterioration of the situation. In February of 1943, the 6th Army capitulated. Approximately 250,000 soldiers had been left surrounded. Only a few thousand would return alive after years of captivity. The defeat marked an irreversible turning point on the Eastern Front. The records of the High Command show that Hitler systematically rejected every proposal of withdrawal. The office of Jodl acted as a transmission channel for these orders, documenting the refusal of any alternative. The failure of Stalingrad confirmed that the strategic initiative had passed to the Soviet Union. In July of 1943, the Battle of Kursk signified the failure of the last German offensive of great scale in the east. From then on, the Wehrmacht was left in a continuous retreat. The function of Jodl was concentrated on coordinating the defensive reorganization and on transmitting the orders of Hitler that demanded to resist in all positions, even when the operational circumstances advised retreating. In June of 1944, the Soviet offensive Bagration destroyed the Army Group Center. In a few weeks, approximately 28 German divisions were annihilated. The Eastern Front crumbled in large sectors, and the available reserves proved insufficient to close the breaches. The operations department of the OKW tried to redistribute resources towards the most threatened points, but the magnitude of the offensive surpassed any capacity for reaction. In that context of collapse, a sector of the officer corps conspired to eliminate Hitler. The 20th of July of 1944, Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb in the conference room of the Wolf's Lair, the headquarters in East Prussia. Jodl was present at the meeting. The explosion caused the death of several officers and injured others, including Jodl himself, who suffered injuries to his face and legs. He was treated and in a few days resumed his functions in the OKW. The assassination attempt failed and gave rise to a wide repression. Thousands of suspects were arrested and hundreds executed after summary trials. Jodl publicly reaffirmed his loyalty to the regime and remained as one of the officers of absolute trust of Hitler. His survival in the attempt and his fidelity kept him in the nucleus of command during the last months of the war. In the autumn of 1944, with the Soviet advance towards the north of Norway, Hitler ordered to apply a scorched earth policy. The 28th of October, Jodl signed a telegram that ordered to evacuate the population to the east of the Lingen Fjord and to destroy in a systematic form all infrastructure. This operation, denominated Northern Lights, caused the forced evacuation of more than 40,000 civilians and the demolition of villages, roads, bridges and ports. The displaced population suffered extreme conditions during the Arctic winter. The 30th of April of 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin. Karl Dönitz was designated as successor and formed a provisional government in Flensburg. His strategy consisted of surrendering to the Western Allies and continuing to resist against the Soviet Union for enough time to evacuate the largest possible quantity of troops and civilians towards the west. The 6th of May, Dönitz sent Alfred Jodl to negotiate with the Allies. The conversations took place in Reims at the headquarters of Dwight David Eisenhower. Jodl proposed a limited surrender on the Western Front, but Eisenhower demanded unconditional capitulation on all fronts. Faced with the threat of closing the Western Front and impeding additional evacuations, Dönitz ordered to accept the conditions. In the early morning of the 7th of May, at 2 hours and 41 minutes, Jodl signed in Reims the document of unconditional surrender in the name of the High Command of the Wehrmacht. The agreement established that the cessation of hostilities would enter into effect the 8th of May at 23 hours and 1 minute. A few hours later, the Soviet command demanded a new signing in Berlin. The night of the 8th of May, Wilhelm Keitel ratified the capitulation before Marshal Zhukov in Karlshorst, officially confirming the end of the war in Europe. The trajectory of Alfred Jodl had passed from the planning of expanding offensives to the administration of defeat and to the signing of the unconditional surrender. His fidelity to superior orders kept him in the center of the command structure until the last days of the regime. The war had ended, but for Jodl a new phase was opening in which his role during the conflict would be examined before international tribunals. Trial in Nuremberg, from the command table to the gallows. The 23rd of May of 1945, barely 16 days after the signing of the capitulation in Reims, British troops surrounded the installations of the provisional government of Karl Dönitz in Flensburg. Among those arrested was Alfred Jodl, who had continued exercising functions as Chief of Operations of the High Command of the Wehrmacht until that moment. After a brief detention in a prisoner camp, he was transferred to Nuremberg to face trial, along with other high leaders of the regime. The International Military Tribunal was established through an agreement between the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Its competence covered 3 categories: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The process began formally the 20th of November of 1945. Jodl was included among the 24 principal accused. The accusations against him were divided into 4 charges: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and conducting of wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The prosecution presented documents that directly linked his office with the transmission of orders contrary to international conventions. Among them were found the Commissar Order of June of 1941, which instructed the immediate execution of Soviet political commissars, the Commando Order of October of 1942, which prescribed the execution of Allied troops captured in special operations, and directives that authorized reprisals against civilian populations. Also included was the order signed in October of 1944 that established the forced evacuation and systematic destruction in the north of Norway. The defense strategy of Jodl was based on the principle of superior orders. He alleged that his role had been limited to transmitting the orders of Hitler and that he lacked the capacity to modify or reject them. He insisted that he had not participated in the formulation of political decisions, nor in the creation of the most controversial directives. He also declared that he did not know the functioning of the extermination camps, which he attributed to the exclusive competence of the SS. During the trial, Jodl argued that his signature on documents should be understood as an administrative act proper to his post, rather than as a personal approval of the content. His wife, Luise von Jodl, collaborated with the defense, providing documents and testimonies to reinforce the idea that disobeying Hitler would have meant exposing himself to extreme consequences, including possible execution for insubordination. The prosecution responded by presenting evidence that Jodl had not been a mere passive executor. The documents showed that he had participated in the elaboration of operational plans and in the coordination of policies that resulted in systematic violations of international law. Furthermore, evidence was introduced that on occasions he had expressed reservations about strategic decisions, such as the division of forces in the Operation Blue. This fact suggested that he had margin to opine and that, therefore, he did not act solely as an automatic transmitter of orders. The tribunal evaluated that in his condition as Chief of Operations of the OKW, Jodl possessed the necessary authority to understand the scope of the orders and to coordinate their practical application. The magnitude of the measures transmitted, including summary executions, collective reprisals, and cooperation with the SS in deportations and security operations, demonstrated a participation that exceeded the sphere of strict obedience. The 1st of October of 1946, the verdict was issued. Alfred Jodl was declared guilty on all 4 charges and sentenced to death by hanging. Along with other condemned, he requested the substitution of the penalty for execution by firing squad, alleging his condition as a military officer. The tribunal rejected the petition, arguing that the crimes committed transcended any consideration of military honor. The execution was set for the early morning of the 16th of October of 1946. 11 condemned were to be executed, although finally there were 10, since Hermann Goering committed suicide by ingesting cyanide a few hours before. The designated executioner was the American Sergeant John Woods. The technical preparation of the executions has been the object of subsequent debate due to the insufficient length of the drops, which in several cases did not cause immediate death by cervical fracture, but by prolonged strangulation. When his turn came, Jodl climbed the scaffold installed in the prison gymnasium without showing signs of hesitation. According to the records, his last words were in German, "I greet you, my eternal Germany." The trapdoor opened and the fall was not sufficient to produce an instantaneous death. The execution was prolonged for several minutes by asphyxiation. He was 56 years old. His body was incinerated along with that of the other executed, and the ashes were scattered in the Isar River to prevent the existence of a burial place that could become an object of political cult. Years later, the case of Alfred Jodl again became the object of debate in post-war Germany. The 28th of February of 1953, a denazification tribunal in Munich declared that he had been unjustly condemned as a war criminal and rehabilitated him posthumously. This decision generated controversy both in Germany and abroad. For some, it represented an attempt to differentiate between professional soldiers and ideological political leaders. For others, it was a denial of the evidence presented in Nuremberg. The controversy was partially resolved a few months later. The 3rd of September of 1953, the Ministry of Political Liberation of Bavaria revoked the rehabilitation, re-establishing the validity of the original conviction. This reversal reflected the international pressures and the internal debate in Germany about how to confront the memory of the National Socialist past. The case of Jodl evidenced the tensions surrounding individual responsibility in authoritarian systems. His trajectory showed how an officer formed in the tradition of the German General Staff could become a gear of a regime that employed the armed forces to implement measures contrary to international law. The discussion about his figure continued beyond his death, reflecting questions about the limits of military obedience and personal responsibility in the framework of criminal decisions. The gallows in Nuremberg, the temporary rehabilitation and the subsequent revocation of that measure became symbols of the legal and political complexity of the post-war period. The name of Alfred Jodl remained linked both to the military structure of the Third Reich and to the subsequent debate on international justice and historical memory, a debate that would remain open in subsequent decades.